started today by talking a little bit about the Constitution and about why we're talking to Mary Beth Tinker today. And then she's going to talk to you guys a little bit about her experience. And then we're going to take questions. So I'll need you guys to be thinking about questions while we're talking. So after we're done with our presentation, you guys can ask Mary Beth your own questions, okay? So I want to show you guys some stuff today. Here we go, we'll get started. There we are. My name is Elizabeth Dinchel, and I actually work at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum in West Branch, Iowa. And Iowa is where Mary Beth is from. She'll talk about that a little bit today. So if you're ever coming through Iowa, you can stop and see us. So first thing up here I have is the U.S. Constitution for you guys to look at. And the Constitution is really important because this is the foundation of our government. The framers of the Constitution established 3 branches of government. Do you guys know what they are and what article of the Constitution corresponds with those? You can type them in your chat box for me. So I want to show you guys while we are doing that. This is the National Archives Constitution webpage, and that shows us the Constitution, of course, which is up there, but it also has all of these really great articles about what the Constitution says, how did it happen, how was it made, and it lets you read the transcript. You can actually go to the catalog and flip through the Constitution, which is really cool. You can zoom in and see it really close. See, here we go. You can see the handwriting really well. It's a very interesting thing to flip through, and I would suggest all of you guys do that. I also have a link on here to the interactive Constitution, and that is at the Constitution Center. And that's really cool because as you scroll your mouse over the Constitution, it will allow you to see how the Constitution has changed over time. And it will tell you what amendments changed the Constitution. So I encourage you guys to do that. Again, the Constitution link is on the National Archives. The interactive Constitution is at the Constitution Center. Who can tell me what year the Constitution was ratified? I know my Hamilton fans out there know. Who can tell me? See, 1776, 1787, 1781, it was ratified. And then after that came the Bill of Rights. There was many people during the founding who were against the Constitution and wanted a Bill of Rights. They felt like the Constitution adequately limited the power of government to only the things that are enumerated in the Constitution. That means outlined. The Bill of Rights actually protects people from the tyranny of government. So all of the things that are included in those first 10 amendments are designed to protect you from the government. James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights and he lobbied for their passage. Sometimes we call him the father of the Constitution, and this is part of the reason. He originally submitted 14, then 12 amendments were presented to the states, and 10 of those were ratified, finally passed in 1791. And this document up here that you guys can see is actually the edits that they were making to the Bill of Rights as they were working on it, which is pretty cool. So who can tell me the rights that are guaranteed by the First Amendment? You can use that chat box. There's 5 that are in there. Do you guys know any of those? Freedom of speech, I see coming up, freedom of speech. So religion, right? So here's the actual First Amendment, and it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble to petition the government for redress of grievances. So here are those things. Freedom of religion, that means you can do whatever you want. When the people framed the Constitution, the big thing was the Church of England was being pushed on them by King George. Freedom of speech, this does not mean that you get speech, you're not free from consequences of your speech. If you go on Facebook and say you hate your job and your boss sees it, there could be consequences for those actions. But what cannot happen is the government cannot arrest you for your speech, and the government cannot punish you for your speech, with exceptions. There are some exceptions. You cannot go into a crowded theater and yell fire, says the Supreme Court. Freedom of press, freedom of assembly, that means the right to protest, although now they regulate time, manner, and place restrictions that were passed by the Supreme Court. And then freedom of petition. So you can sign petitions and deliver those to the government to try and get new laws passed or get things changed. So let me ask you guys a question. What happens when your constitutional rights are infringed by the government? What do you guys think? You can write in that chat box there. You can sue. That's right, absolutely. And as you sue, you can continue to appeal, and your case will move up in the courts. This is a picture of the Supreme Court. This is where Mary Beth Tinker's case ended up, and she'll talk a little bit about that. And this is in our third article of the Constitution, and this is called judicial review. So Congress writes a law, the president passes it, it's enacted, and then if citizens feel like it infringes on their rights, they can file for judicial review. If it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, then it becomes law. It can even become law at the federal level. We call that case law. So we're going to pass it to Mary Beth and have her talk a little bit about what freedom of speech looks like for students and about her case. And I'm going to stop my screen share here for you, Mary Beth.
Okay.
And you can jump in and share.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Therese, and thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Hoover Library and Museum. It's so good to be with all of you out there in Iowa, where I lived for many years. Right now, I'm in Washington, D.C. So all of these rights and the Constitution, is that for young people? Does it cover kids? That was the question. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what happened with me. I was growing up in Des Moines, Iowa, and I didn't know about all these rights, but I knew that us kids should have some things to say too. So I do believe that kids are the next great leap for democracy. Our democracy is always growing and changing, just like kids. And when young people have a say and speak up and use those First Amendment rights, the right to free speech, to assemble, free press, petition, and religion, and having your own views, it's so powerful and it helps democracy. And young people are doing this all over the country. Here's a few of the kids who I've met who are doing that. Here's some kids in Iowa who are protesting the oil pipeline because they thought it was going to hurt the earth and pollute. And I was really glad to meet these kids and see how they were standing up for a clean earth. And that's going on all over the country with students. And I know some of you are speaking up about that also. And I'd like to hear more about how you're doing that. Here are some kids who were protesting about March for Our Lives and for safer gun laws. And they don't want to be shot. I'm a nurse, and I've taken care of so many kids as a trauma nurse. A trauma nurse is someone who takes care of kids who have trauma, like getting shot or getting in a car crash. And so I was so glad to see these kids in Iowa, like so many of you, speaking up for safer gun laws. Here's kids in Iowa speaking up against racism and Black Lives Matter. And that's so important. And that's what we did too. When I was a kid, we spoke up against racism. And I'll tell you about how that led to the Supreme Court case that said that you have a right to speak up in your schools and in your communities. And here are some kids recently in Des Moines. They were protesting too. They were using their right. What rights? The freedom of assembly, the freedom of free speech, and they used the freedom of free press, and they got in the press. Here's the Des Moines Register showing how some of the kids were protesting that their schools were shutting down their athletic programs because of COVID. And a student, Keith, at Roosevelt, he said, our district made a choice for health for the students and the staff, but that doesn't mean that we should have our season taken away. And they're trying to find a way that it could work for everyone, still be safe from COVID, but also do sports. So they're using their voices to advocate for themselves. And that's what the First Amendment is all about, having a say about issues that affect your life. And so kids are saying, yes, you should have a say about that too. And it's very exciting that so many young people, and I know so many of you also have issues you care about that you're using your free speech rights and your First Amendment rights for. I didn't know about all these rights when I was growing up in Des Moines. That's me and my sister Hope. And we were ordinary kids. We went to school and we studied for our classes. My dad was a Methodist minister first in Atlantic, Iowa, and then in Des Moines. And he taught us the lesson that you should care about other people and that we can't just think of ourselves, we have to also think of others. That was the basis of our faith. And that's the basis of all faiths, love, understanding. And that was the lesson that we learned growing up. My parents also believed that you should put that into action. You shouldn't just talk about it all the time. You should do something in your life to make that real, and also to make democracy real and those ideals of democracy like equality and justice. And so that's what they taught us growing up. When I was 10 years old, I saw some amazing kids on the news, thanks to the free press. They were in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were protesting racism. They were the Black Lives Matter, really, of our time. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves the Birmingham Children's Crusade. But they were also speaking up against racism, just like Black Lives Matter young people are doing right now today. I thought these kids were so brave to do this. And I knew that I was too shy to do that back then. I was really, shy, and I was one of the youngest of the family. There were 6 kids in our family. But I thought they were so amazing. But to punish them, the white supremacists, yes, there were white supremacists then, and there are now too. White supremacists thought that these kids should not speak up against racism. And so to punish them, they put a bomb in their church right on Sunday morning, knowing that it would go off when the kids were all at Sunday school. And so sure enough, the bomb went off on September 15th. I had just turned 11 years old, 1963, when someone came by our picnic to tell us what had happened to those brave, brave kids who were speaking up against racism. 4 of them were found killed in the church: Cynthia, Denise, Addie Mae, and Carol. They were heroes for our democracy and heroes for the values that we care about: understanding and love and democracy. And I thought those kids were just so brave, and I was so sad. And so that year in Des Moines, there was a memorial service for the kids, and it was called for by a writer named James Baldwin, an amazing man, and another amazing man named Bayard Rustin, who helped to organize the March on Washington. But that year, 1963, in September, they called for people all over the country to wear black armbands, just plain black armbands, because those are a symbol of being sad, a symbol of mourning. So that's me in the middle, and my sisters, Bonnie and Hope, there on the right, and our friends, Linda and Phyllis, at the memorial service in Des Moines, where we wore black armbands to say how sad we were. That's called symbolic speech. You say something, but you're not using words, you're using a symbol. Maybe some of you have a symbol right now that you can think of. That was my first experience with black armbands. And then by 1965, when the Vietnam War was really building up and we were seeing scenes like this on the news all the time, we were getting sadder and sadder, and we didn't know what to do. So some kids at the high school had an idea: what if we wear black armbands again this year to show how sad we are about the war? It was Christmas time, and it's a time of of love, and you send those little Christmas cards around that say peace on earth. And us kids thought, yeah, why don't the adults try having peace on earth? And they should stop the war and try to negotiate an answer to the war, to the misunderstanding that was going on in Vietnam. And so we decided to wear black armbands again, but this time to school. And that's me and my brother John with a black armband. Well, first when I went to school, I was 13 years old in 8th grade. John was in 10th grade. There were about 8 kids who wore black armbands. We didn't have the peace sign on our armbands though. It was just plain black at first. And so I got to school and I was really nervous because the principals had heard about our plan and they made a rule against armbands. It was 1965. And I was in 8th grade at Warren Harding Junior High School in Des Moines. And so I was really nervous and everything, but I didn't know if I should wear the armband, but I kept thinking of those Birmingham kids and how brave they were to speak up for what they believed in. And I thought I should be brave too. So I went to school and I was really nervous, and John went to school. And when I got to school, I was given a pink pass like this and sent to the office. When I got down there, the vice principal, Mr. Willitson, said, now, Mary Beth, take off that armband because it's against the rules. And so I had on my armband and I looked around and I was really nervous and scared. And I said, okay, Mr. Willitson. And I took off the armband. But I learned a very important lesson that day. You don't have to be the bravest person. You can be you. You can be nervous. You can be scared, and you can still say something. You can still do something to speak up for what you believe is right. I got suspended that day anyway, and 5 kids got suspended in different schools in Des Moines. And it maybe would have been the end of the whole thing, except for a group called the American Civil Liberties Union. And there's one of the boys who got suspended, Chris Eckhart. The American Civil Liberties Union said, you should go back to the school board and try to change their mind. And so that's Chris at the school board, and we all went to the school board and tried to change their mind, but they wouldn't change their mind. And they said, we're gonna keep the rule against black armbands. And so the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, they go to the Supreme Court more than any organization in the United States, because they're all about the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. So they said, well, we're going to have to take this to the court. And so that's what happened. A court case started and it went through the courts. And when I was a junior in high school in 1969, the Supreme Court said by 7-2 that the principals had been wrong. And the teacher had been wrong to send me to the office, and the school board had been wrong, and that us kids were right, and that we did have a right to wear armbands, and we did have a right to express ourselves, and we did have a right to the First Amendment in schools. They said there's two things that kids can't do in public schools, and that's number 1, substantially disrupt school with your free speech, and number 2, impinge on the rights of others. And what that means has been debated ever since. I had no idea how important that case, the ruling, was going to be even all these years, 50 years later. And I grew up and I went to nursing school, and that's me working on my nursing floor with, where I worked with kids. I was a family nurse practitioner and I was a registered nurse. And I had a background in public health, and I started to see how, you know, kids don't really have a fair deal too often in our society. The school budgets are being cut back too often, and too often the air is being polluted and the water is being polluted. And so kids need to stand up and use their rights. And so that's why I started traveling all over the country and speaking up and encouraging young people like all of you to know the Constitution, know the First Amendment, and then to use it, because the First Amendment, your rights are like your muscles. You're born with rights, and these are human rights and constitutional rights. But if you don't use them, you could lose them. And here's one of my last stops where I went back to my old junior high school, my middle school, Warren Harding, and we had a big assembly there to celebrate the case called Tinker versus Des Moines, and the superintendent of schools, Tom Ahart, came, and the principal, and they even gave me my own locker back at my old middle school. So now I have a locker there, and I asked kids all over the country, what should I put in there? And they said, put some armbands and put constitutions in there. And so that's what I did to celebrate your rights and the rights of kids all over the country and all over the world, because this is an international human rights issue, the rights of kids. So now I'm going to open it up for your comments and questions, and I want to hear from all of you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, so if you guys start putting your questions in the comment box, I'll start kind of going through them and getting them to Mary Beth. Mary Beth, I'll start off with a question to kind of get the students thinking. How is Tinker versus Des Moines being used for social media policies for students at schools?
Yes, it's being used. Well, when the Tinker ruling, when it was decided in February of 1969, as I said, the Supreme Court said that there are two things students cannot do. Number one, substantially disrupt school and impinge on the rights of others. So if you do something on social media that can be said to substantially disrupt school, then that could be censored, or they could stop this. For example, a student did something, he made a rap video that had some obscenity in it, and it had a threat to a teacher, and it ended up in the school, and it was shown to disrupt school. So the student was punished. That was called Taylor Bell, that case. Another case where students wore American flag shirts to school in California. But why did they do that? They did it to mock the Mexican kids, to make fun of them, because they wore the shirts on Cinco de Mayo, which is a very important holiday for Mexican people. And so the principal said that that was going to cause a substantial disruption, number one, and number two, that it was impinging on the rights of the Mexican kids to feel safe at school. So they were stopped from doing that. And that was an important case as well. That was called Dariano. That was a few years ago. So there are various ways that, the cases, but one of the important parts of the ruling said that neither students or teachers leave their constitutional right to expression at the schoolhouse gate. But now that's been expanded to also cover things that students do outside of school that affect school. So it's still being debated, and there's still a lot of gray area about how it's all going to affect students.
So someone asked, did you get to go to school while your case was being decided?
Yes, we did go to school while it was being decided because, I was in 8th grade. It was December when I was suspended. It was right at Christmas holiday. And so then when we went back to school in January, the lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union said, well, you can't wear your black armbands back to school because you'll just keep getting suspended and put out of school. So we stopped wearing the black armbands, but then we just wore all black clothes for the rest of the year. And so I always like to encourage students, there's a way to get your message across. You just have to be creative. And I could tell you about various creative ways that students have gotten their message across, whether it has to do with students speaking up for better school lunches, or students speaking up for having technology during the COVID times, whether it has to do with dress codes, what students wear, what they say, all kinds of different issues like that.
So someone asked a question, do you regret taking the armband off?
No, I don't really regret taking it off because that's who I was. I was scared, I was nervous, and it taught me an important lesson that even if you're scared, even if you're nervous, you can still do something. And it's so great to see so many kids right now speaking up about all different things. We have a very important election coming up. Students are getting involved in that. You don't have to be old enough to vote to have an effect. Some students are talking to their parents' friends about the issues that affect children, the issues that affect young people, whether it has to do with, guns or pollution, healthy environments, school, money for schools, all different issues that affect kids right now today.
So a lot of people are asking how long your case went on for, and I guess it's probably cool to talk about that and talk about like what you were doing at different stages during the case.
Yeah, the case started in at Christmas time, 1965, and then we won in February of 1969 by 7-2. That was the ruling, 7 Supreme Court justices. Well, first we lost at the district court level, and then we lost at the appeals level as well. So it took about 3 years. Now, by the way, when we lost at the appeals level, over in Mississippi, there were some Black high school students who had been protesting some different murders by the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacists. 3 young people were killed in Mississippi in 1964. And their names were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner. They were killed by the Ku Klux Klan, and the sheriff played a part in organizing the killing also. And so some Black high school kids in Mississippi wore buttons to school to protest the murders by the KKK. And they were told that they could not wear those buttons to school and that they did not have free speech in school to wear those buttons. So there was a case that started then, even before we wore our armbands. And their case was working its way through the courts, and they won their case at the appeals level, at the circuit court. It's called the appeals level or the circuit courts. There's 13 of those in the country, and each of those usually covers several states. So up in Iowa, a little while later, in 1966, we lost at the appeals level, but the Mississippi kids had just won at the appeals level. So you see, different circuit courts can decide different things, and that was a perfect situation for an appeal to the Supreme Court. And our lawyers said, fine, let's appeal this to the Supreme Court and let them decide. So that case in Mississippi turned out to be very, very important for the rights of young people in public schools. It was called Burnside, that case. When they won in Mississippi, the court said that they should win and be allowed to protest the murders by the KKK. Why? Because they had not substantially disrupted school. So that's where that standard comes from. That was then later used in the Tinker ruling as well. The substantial disruption standard still holds today, and it goes all the way back to African-American high school students in Mississippi in 1964 who stood up against racism. So a lot of the rights that you have in public school right now today go back to students speaking up against racism.
So here's another good one. Aaron asked, did your parents encourage you, discourage you, or just say, do what you want?
No, well, my dad didn't think that we should wear the black armbands. He said, these principals have a job to do. It's not so easy, but kids are so persuasive. And so we said, but wait, Dad, you always taught us that we should stand up for our conscience and that we should stand up for what we believe in. And that was how he had raised us. And so we were able to win him over to our side. And then he understood why we were doing it. And then he stood beside us. So we were lucky for that. But if you want to speak up about something and you're looking for someone to support you in doing that, try to find someone. If it's not a parent, maybe one of your siblings, a teacher, a friend, someone, or you can look and see what's going on in your community, in your state, of groups that are involved with that issue that you care about, whatever your issue is. You can always find others that also care about that, and then you can see how you can connect with them. And that's when we get, more powerful for our issue to make a change, because when you have numbers behind you, you have more power.
So there's two good questions. One person had asked, did kids make fun of you while this was going on? And then someone asked, after the case, did your friends or classmates treat you guys differently?
Some kids made fun of me a little bit, not too bad though. I remember that day at lunchtime when I was wearing the black armband, because I wore the armband all morning and nobody really cared very much. But at lunchtime, some kids there was a boys' table for lunch and the girls' table. So I sat at the girls' table. So the boys started teasing me and saying, I want an armband for Christmas. So I just ignored them like I always did. But some of the kids at the high school, like Bruce Clark was at the high school. He had really started the whole thing. Bruce Clark, Ross Peterson, they were at lunch and some kid, I think, punched him. And also their gym teacher threatened them. People like to call, we got called communists. Mostly the people who hassled us and bullied us were adults. They would call us communists, and then they would throw red paint at our house, which is the color of communists.
Well, this goes good because someone had asked, were you worried that you would be murdered for protesting? So can you tell us about like that hate mail and stuff that came to your house?
Yeah, someone's threatened to blow up our house on Christmas Eve, which was really bewildering because we were speaking up for peace at Christmas time. Our message in wearing the armbands was to mourn for the dead on both sides in Vietnam. That's how we were raised. We should be sad about death and people being killed. It came from our church. It came from our faith upbringing. That was one of our messages. And the other message was to call for a truce at Christmas time so that the two sides could negotiate. So when people started threatening us and throwing things at our house and threatening to blow up our house, and this lady called and said on the phone to me, I'm gonna kill you. It was really bewildering and confusing because as a kid, I was just speaking up for peace. And that's why it was really confusing to me. And people would call us communists. My mother would say, we're not communists, we're Methodists. But by that time, we were also more involved with the Quakers as well, and their religion that is all about peace as well. But I started to find out that if you speak up for what you believe in, you may not always be popular, but that's okay because there are more important things. And I learned through the years that, you know, in the end, you can do the right thing and you can connect with a lot of people around the country and around the world who also are speaking up for peace and for justice and equality and all of our democratic values. And that's a good way of life.
So we had a question come in from a teacher, and she said, as a teacher, I'm interested to know how your teachers reacted to the armbands. Were they vocal in their support or opposition?
The teachers pretty much ignored it, except for my math teacher, Mr. Moberly, he was my favorite teacher. I loved math. Well, I love social studies too, but I really loved math. So Mr. Moberly sent me to the office. Other teachers basically ignored it. One teacher later in the year kind of hurt my feelings and said, oh, well, there's going to be a pep rally this weekend, but oh, I guess Mary Beth, you have more important things to do. And it just kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. But one reason why we won the case was because the school district, and by the way, since then, the Des Moines schools and schools all over the country have been wonderful about the case. And I even speak at superintendents conventions and principals conventions because most administrators and teachers really want their kids to have a voice, to speak up, to get involved, to make a difference. And that's what this case is about. It's about the input of young people and how our democracy is stronger when young people get involved. So I've been very happy to see how many adults really do stand by young people and want them to have a voice.
So one of the students asked, do you have any regrets about what you did, the whole thing?
I don't have that many regrets. I think I probably should have been a little more aware of how important the case was, because when we went to the Supreme Court, I had just moved to a new high school in a whole new city, St. Louis. And it was really scary because I thought St. Louis was such a big city, and my high school, I didn't know anybody. I was in 11th grade when I moved there. And so I was really more worried about things like what I was going to do on the weekend and whether I would get along with people in algebra class and things like that. And I didn't get that this case was going to turn out to be the most important thing going on in my life right then. So yeah, I guess I would have wished that I was paying a little more attention to what was going on and things like that, but that's about all.
So someone asked earlier if you've been involved in any movements since the armband incident.
Yes, I have, because I found that it's a good way of life to get involved and to pay attention, and also that the changes that you want made in life, whether it has to do with a cleaner environment or whether it's, ending racism or having economic equality, better pay for families, as a nurse, and public health person, I'm very concerned about COVID and how it's been, I think, mishandled, and how we could have done a much, much better job in our country. So if you care about things, then you almost have to get involved. And I found out that it's a good way of life, as I said. So yes, I get involved with healthcare and kids' rights issues, standing up against racism, housing, affordable housing issues, clean air, clean water. I was very upset when there was lead in the water in not only Flint, Michigan, but many other cities that I travel to around the country have lead in the water. And that's a toxin for the brains of children. So yeah, you might want to check your water, everybody, and make sure how it is. But some of these issues are things that I care about. Girls' rights, Native American rights. Native Americans couldn't even vote in our country till the 60s. So I think there's been a lot of mistreatment that needs to be corrected, and that we have to talk about these things honestly in order to make things better. We can't just cover them up.
So I think I'm getting more questions about whether or not you were feeling scared about threats and stuff. And I think, and students, you guys can kind of chime in with me. I think maybe the reason that you guys are thinking about this, it's a really negative kind of thing that goes along with movements, is to be afraid. And I think that you guys ask that because maybe you want to change things, but you're afraid of what other people might do and how they might react to you. And there's some history, of course, with how people react to movements. But Mary Beth, like, what do you think about like kids having fears? Like if they want to go out and protest like the oil pipelines, or if they want to go out and protest for Black Lives Matter, how can they overcome their fear and be brave in the face of that?
Yes, well, it helps to join up with other people. I go to schools where they've started clubs called like current events clubs. There's a school in Maryland, not too far from me. They started a current events club that meets every week in the school. Well, it did before COVID. Now they're meeting virtually to talk about different issues. This case is also about controversy and how to deal with controversial issues in ways that are respectful, and where we can, put things out there and not just cover them up and sweep them under the rug. Yes, there is going to be controversy in our democracy. Without that, we don't have a democracy, and we don't have education. And that's what the Supreme Court said in the ruling of our case. Controversy and feelings about issues, and sometimes even fear about talking about things, that's part of our democracy that we have to be willing to live with and to deal with and to cope with. Otherwise, we don't have forward movement. So yeah, if you're scared, think about talking about the issue, find out who else is speaking up about that issue. And you can hook up with them. There's power in numbers. And then you won't be so scared. And also, I always ask kids, well, how did you, like kids go to the school board to talk about, maybe a uniform policy, or maybe some kids, like I was at their school and every water faucet was taped up because they had lead in their water. That was in, I think, in New York. And the students were speaking up about that. And I asked them, how do you feel when you go to the city council to speak? They said, oh, I felt great. It was so good. We got on the agenda and we made some signs. Or some kids in Rhode Island, they dressed up like guinea pigs and rats. And they went to the state legislature and they had a lot of fun doing it. Kids in Ohio, where I went, they had painted this big rock in front of their school orange with all the names of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kids who had been shot. And they went on a bus to the legislature to rally for safer gun laws. And I asked them, how did you feel? They said they felt great. They were so glad to be taking action. And that's another reason why I encourage all of you kids to speak up, and why I travel to encourage kids all over the country. Because as a nurse, I find it's good for your health. It's good for your physical health, your social health, your emotional and mental health. Everybody's worried about kids' mental health right now because you're isolated, and it's not good for teenagers to be so isolated. Well, there's something you can do to help your mental health, to stay strong, and that's to get involved with an issue that's bigger than you, that matters not only to you, but to others in the community and in the world as well. And it's good for your health in so many ways. That's what I found.
So someone asked, this is a really good question. Did the Tinker versus Des Moines ruling apply to publics, also apply to private schools? Because it of course applies to public schools, but does it apply at private schools?
Yeah, the ruling relied on the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has to do with equal justice and other things as well. But so equal justice, and the First Amendment, the right to free speech and to express yourself. So that is in the Constitution. It has to do with the government is not allowed to censor your speech. Of course, all rights have limits. The right to free speech has limits. You can't say anything you feel like anytime in any place that you feel like it. There are limits to it. And in the Tinker ruling, it said you can't use it to substantially disrupt school, for example. So there is a limit to that, and there are always limits, but still, the right to the First Amendment and the right to the 14th Amendment were very, very important, and that's what the court relied. But the Constitution, the First Amendment, says that the government cannot censor your speech, your right to assemble, your right to your own religion, your right. So it applies to public schools. A private school, the idea there is that you are going there voluntarily. Public schools are mandated. It's a law. You have to go to public school till a certain age, usually 16. In a private school, it doesn't cover it. But the Tinker ruling has had an effect on private schools anyway. And traveling around the country, I find that a lot of time private schools even have more rights, it seems like, than some students in public schools. So it really can vary, but legally, the ruling affects public schools.
So someone asked if there would ever be a time that it would be acceptable to resort to violence for change.
Well, personally, I don't believe that violence is morally useful or even effective. So I am a nonviolent person, and I believe that we should make change through our words and our actions that are not violent.
So someone else asked, have you met any students that just don't want a voice?
Students that don't want a voice? Yes. Yeah, I meet students who just say, I don't really want to get involved. I'm good with the way things are right now. And, they're okay with it. So, sure. But I still say it's a good way of life. to speak up about things and to get involved. And there's always right now, I mean, there's a lot of improvement that we can make in our world right now today. It's like the author of Cat in the Hat, Dr. Seuss, that wasn't his real name, but he said, they asked him, what advice do you have for kids today? And he said, kids, we can do better, and we must. And we can do better than what we have right now in the world today. And kids are going to be a huge part of making that happen and making a better world. When kids are not active and not engaged, and it's cheating kids, it's cheating you yourselves, but it's also cheating the whole society for your wonderful ideas, your creativity, your energy. Kids can solve some problems better than adults. And there have been all these studies that show that that's true. Because why? It's like a 7th grader in Ohio told me. She said, you know, I think it's because we're just fresher. And I was like, yes, you are. You're fresher. You come to problems with fresh eyes. You don't just get used to the way things are. You're saying like, wait a minute now, why do we have all these homeless people? Like this boy who started Trevor's project. And he's like, wait, this is crazy. Why do we have people sleeping on the streets? We can do better than that. And that's the strength and the beauty of all of you young people.
All right, I want to show you guys something real quick, and then we'll go back and do our last question with Mary Beth, because we got a lot of questions about more cases and where you can find more information. So what I have up here for you guys right now is the Supreme Court website. And this is really interesting because you can look at the opinions, the filings, the rulings. You can look at all of the oral arguments, the case documents. And if you scroll down here, you can see the calendar for upcoming oral arguments. If you guys didn't know this, cameras are not allowed in the Supreme Court. So you can listen to the oral arguments, which are still recorded, but you cannot watch them. So they're all archived here on the Supreme Court website, and you can see the little audio buttons, so you guys can listen to those oral arguments. I also want to kick back to the United States Courts webpage for you, and that's uscourts.gov. They had a whole podcast about Tinker versus Des Moines, but they also have the decision, the oral argument, and they have activities for students to learn more about Tinker versus Des Moines and understanding how this is a landmark case. We call it a landmark case because it is the case law right now. So Tinker versus Des Moines is still the law. So I just wanted to give you guys those 2 links so you can follow what's going on with the Supreme Court and so you can learn more about Tinker versus Des Moines. And it also has related cases on here. Somebody was saying the cases were really interesting. You can look at those related cases and see what other cases have come up that Tinker versus Des Moines was used to interpret the decision. So I will turn that off, and I think we'll ask Mary Beth our last question. And I think this is a really interesting question and a good way to think about this. What do you think would have happened if you guys never wore the armbands?
If we never wore the armbands, I think some other kids would have worn the armbands probably the next month or soon after we did, because there was so much there was so much feeling about the war. And really this case is about feelings and how to feel what you feel. And that's another thing kids are so very good at. And then do something about your feelings. It's a story about how even sadness and grief, that feeling, you can take action and it can make a difference. And there were so many kids that were feeling all of this during that early time in the Vietnam War, when about 1,000 US soldiers had been killed, and eventually 58,000 and more soldiers would be killed directly and many more indirectly. Actually, right now, today, about 20 Vietnam veterans per day kill themselves. And that's another reason why I'm part of a group to decrease gun violence called Moms Demand Action, because too often, most of the gun violence in our country has to do with suicide, and much of it affects Vietnam veterans. And I know a lot of you probably had family in the war, and it was very emotional. And so, you know, that's why I think if we wouldn't have worn the armbands, probably some other kids would have spoken up about various issues that they care about, because there are so many issues. And by the way, I just want to mention before we leave that if any of you students want to write to me at tinkertour@gmail.com. And if teachers would like me to speak to your class, I'm offering that this year with the virtual learning and COVID and everything. And I care about all of you teachers, and I just appreciate you so much. And if I can help in any way, let me know, because I'll be glad to do calls with your classes.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. This was awesome. And thank you all you students for your good questions and your thoughts today and engaging with us and staying on the call. We really appreciate it. And definitely follow the Supreme Court and keep aware of what's going on around you. You have rights even if you're not old enough to vote, so exercise them.
Right.
All right, thank you everybody. We really appreciate you coming today. Thank you so much, Mary Beth and Elizabeth, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Reese. Thanks, everybody. Here's to kids and the First Amendment. It was great being with all of you. Bye.